Today's topic is the women of the YWCA, and you may know that the Y was actually housed in what's known as the Crane House. We now call it the Crane House and Historic YWCA because from 1920 to 1965, it was a YWCA primarily for African American women and girls. They began to integrate a little bit later on, but we'll get into that as we talk through the presentation. The YWCA and the women who were part of it is really quite a fascinating and compelling story, at least in my mind. This is the earliest known picture that we have of the women of the YWCA. That's the Crane House behind it. And they had taken possession of it in about 1920, and I suspect that this may have been one of the very earliest pictures that they took, sort of celebrating the fact that they just bought it based on the clothing. But we don't know who these women are. We don't know whether or not they are the people who were the boarders who lived there, or whether they were the women who helped to found it. We only know one story of one of the women, and that's this woman here. And she came in, shut the lights off? Okay. Her granddaughter came into our site one day and saw her picture hanging there, said, "That's my grandmother." And she knew that she lived in a boarding house. That's much better, thank you. We knew that she lived in a boarding house, and our hope was that that would tell us that that was the boarders that lived there, and she was one of the boarders at the YWCA. But it turned out when we did some research that no, that was impossible because she owned her own boarding house by 1920 when the YWCA was opened at the Crane House when they purchased it. So a little more research, we found out that she had been a teacher before she migrated north as part of the Great Migration. And when she got up here, she couldn't teach up here because the schools were integrated. Down south, when the schools were segregated, it was perfectly fine for her to teach the black children, but when she got up here, she couldn't teach a combined class. And so she had to find other ways to make money, and so that's when she opened up her own boarding house. So the story we're about to tell is the story of our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, and as I said, it's a story that is incredibly compelling. That's my great-great-grandmother, Lidia Olive Johnson, who I know married at least 3 times, and I don't know why or how. But she seemed to have left all of her husbands still alive, so she must have divorced them back in the late 1800s, which I think is pretty remarkable. So the story starts when the railroad comes to town in Montclair. Now this is a wonderful picture of, can anyone guess? Applegate Farms. Yeah, that's Applegate Farms. And that is taken, I think, from Park Street looking down, but you can see it says Applegate Farm very, very faintly up there. And then the railroad came to town, and it began to change everything. It was no longer this bucolic community that it had been based on agriculture in the past, and instead there began to be developments. The farms were divided up into lots, and people began to come through and live in this more of a suburban community than it had been in the past. This made the cities far more accessible. You could get from downtown Montclair to Hoboken in not much more time than it takes today on the train. But the cities became more accessible, and this fueled the growth of Montclair even more than it had in the past. And so that's when the developers moved in, and the developers began to divide, as I said, all those farms into lots and build big houses. Some big, some small, but the big ones really are key to the story that we're going to tell today. Because once you have those big houses, you need workers for them, and you need to have servants working for you, gardeners, chauffeurs, that fit the lifestyle. But also you needed to have people laying the infrastructure. By the 1890s, Montclair is beginning to become really the community that we know it is today. That's when the sewer lines went in, that's when the fire department was formed, that was when the police department was formed. So you're really beginning to see a change in the town, but you need people to do this work. And so the Italian immigrants, for example, were the ones that really did a lot of the laying of the sewer lines and a lot of the masonry work because they brought those skills over from the old country. So you can see as you look, the population begins to have gardeners on it and laborers all listed down there. And this is actually a picture of the Pine Street area. So there were barracks almost, or tenements where people would live. And then once you began to get those workers in, then you needed to have programs and businesses that supported those folks. And so you can see here, St. Paul's Baptist Church. This is from one of our directories that we have, and you can see that it specifically says who they cater to. Interestingly, Union Baptist doesn't, and that had a similar, it was also an African American church. And also down in the areas where the workers congregated, you began to see more and more businesses supporting it. The Italian jellies and groceries would start up. There'd be businesses that were specifically for the African American folk who moved into town. So the businesses began to reflect the change. So that's what's going on nationally. And then there are these three other trends that we haven't spoken about yet. One is that women are really getting involved in social justice. There's also a huge migration from the southern states following Jim Crow laws. And then you also have the development of YW and YMCAs. We're going to look at each one of those a little bit more closely. First of all, the Women for Social Justice. And there we have a lovely woman who probably has all this time on her hand because she's got servants working for her. And what can she do now to help her make a difference in the world? There were several acceptable outlets for her. One was home. She could stay home and be a loving mother and wife. She could get involved in church organizations. She could get involved in different charity programs. And I'll share a couple of Montclair women who did that. And she can get involved in campaigns of some sort. If she were really daring, she could become a suffragette. But those are really the outlets where these women could look for ways to contribute to social justice. Now, this is one of the women in Montclair who did. Her name is Margaret Jane Power, and Mrs. Power was driving, the story goes, Mrs. Power was driving home one day and saw a child fall from the third floor of a building in Montclair. And there was no place for him to be cared for, because at the time, if you were ill or injured, you'd be cared for in your home. But this child didn't have the wealth. His family didn't have the wealth to be able to bring a physician into their house to care for them. So Mrs. Power decided that we really needed a hospital in town, and she formed Mountainside Hospital. And she worked with a lot of women and men. Men primarily were the ones who were working on the finances, and they also were some of the physicians, but there actually were some female physicians on staff. And until the late 1920s, that organization, which I find so fascinating, was actually led primarily by women. This is the directory from 1908, and if you look at it, the president is Mrs. Franklin Hooper, Vice Presidents, Mrs. Franklin Dorman, Miss Margaret Jarvie, Miss Kate Dalrymple, Mrs. White, Mrs. Davis, Miss Schultz, Mrs. LeBrun, Mrs. Edith. So it was all women who were running this organization. And then basically when you look at the history of Mountainside Hospital, there was a coup, if you want to call it that, back in about 1928, when all of a sudden the men ousted the women and took control of running that organization. Another one in Montclair who was very involved was Minnie Lucy. Has anybody heard of her? Minnie Lucy started the Minnie Lucy, the Baldwin Street School. It was a settlement house, basically. And the goal was to bring people in, the immigrants, and help people become better Americans, become American citizens. And she used to, and live up to the standards of an American culture, quote unquote. And she started this program for children, teaching children how to care for their brothers and sisters, because she found more and more when she talked with the women that they were going out to work, leaving these children in charge of the children at home, and these children needed to learn how to take care of their siblings. So she started this program, and apparently the story goes that it was so popular that people would borrow kids, younger kids, so they could go to this program with her. So that building still stands today, but she was really quite, she was a Montclair woman who was very involved in trying to find an area where she didn't feel there was social justice and make it happen. The second is the migration from the southern states. So following the Civil War, Reconstruction occurred. That failed, and Jim Crow laws began to be put into place. And the Jim Crow laws were really oppressive. And that and an opportunity for a better life is what led a lot of the former enslaved people up from the South into the North. And they came by car and they came by train. And the train went right through Montclair, so you can begin to see where this is leading. You can see that they followed different corridors, depending on where you're from. And we still today, and you'll see in the census data that South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia is where a lot of people came from to come to Montclair in New York City. There's a wonderful book called The Warmth of Other Suns, that if you haven't, by Isabel Wilkerson, if you haven't read it yet, it's a great book. It explains the Great Migration. And what it does is it follows a person and a family through each one of these different tracks. And it shows the different experiences they had, how they got here, and also what they encountered. One of the reasons a lot of people came to Montclair is, first of all, the train went right through it, but second of all, there were jobs here. There was plenty of work in the large homes in Montclair. They could work as butlers, maids, cooks, childcare, gardeners, chauffeurs. But there's also a lot of professionals that have moved in as well. There were teachers, there were physicians, there were nurses, there were doctors, there was a large professional middle class, and by the 1920s, Montclair actually had one of the largest African-American middle classes in New Jersey. So the demographics in Montclair began to change, whereas in 1870, according to the census data, there were 37 African-Americans living in Montclair. By 1900, you had about 1,300, or 10% of the population. But it was an unequal town, the Claridge Theater. If you were African American, you'd have to sit on one side of the theater. If you went to the Wellmont, you'd have to sit upstairs. You could not go have ice cream at Grunning's. If you went to Bonds, even up until the 1940s and 50s, after a football game, the football players could go in and get an awful. But the fans could not if you were African American.
So they allowed the black African athletes to have the
Yes,
but
yes, but not if you were just a fan.
Wow.
Yep. And there was even a cross burning here in Montclair. This gentleman wanted to fell in love and was going to marry a white woman, and he came clean when they went for the marriage license. And she didn't know that he actually had or was mixed race. So they go to get the marriage license. She discovers that he is mixed race, and she's fine with it, but the family isn't. It begins to create all sorts of news, and sure enough, that night, a cross burned on his lawn. She was still willing to go through with it, but her parents forbade it. And he wound up moving to Philadelphia, and she wound up staying here in Montclair, so they never married. But it's interesting because I had one scholar talk about the dividing line, and he says that it's not just African American and white, it can be Mexican, it can be any population. When the minority population hits about 15%, that's when the rest of the world begins to notice, and they begin to try and figure out how can we retain what we have. And sure enough, just in 1920, when you begin to see the cross burning and protests at the theaters, that's when the line crossed to about 15% here in Montclair. And it's interesting even if you think of that today, because when you look at the population today, you begin to see the Mexican population creeping up into that neighborhood, and now there's sort of this thrust to build walls and separate. And so I wonder if this is the same kind of situation as we had back then. The third national trend is the development of the YW, the YMCA movement. It started at Smith College. Don't those women look like they're ready to play tennis in their little bustles? They wanted to recreate a Christian home for these girls who were going away, God forbid, to college. And so they wanted to make sure that they could uphold those Christian values, and so they started this organization called the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association. From there, it expanded into the cities, because if these young women were actually going to go and live and work in the cities, there's got to be some way to counterbalance the cold, impersonal, immoral city and the demoralizing and unsavory forces that they're likely to encounter when they get into that city. And then it began to expand across the races. African American women found that there was a place for it in this separate and unequal world that we talked about. They began to see the value in the training and housing that the Y could offer. And so you begin to see YWCAs springing up around the country. Now, what's interesting about YWCAs and YMCAs is during that period, you'd have a white YMCA and a white YWCA. If the organizations in that community felt that there was a need, they could have sort of satellite branches, if you will, in that separate but equal philosophy of a black YMCA and a black YWCA. And the Washington Street School, or the Washington Street Y, where my kids learned to swim, was the black YMCA in town. The Crane House became the black YWCA in town. But what's interesting about this is there was no white YWCA in town. So these black women in 1912 took it upon themselves to start their own YWCA. And this caused a lot of consternation at the national level, but they persisted. And so here you have this confluence of trends. In 1912, this woman, Alice Huey, or Hu Foster, we don't know exactly how it was pronounced, started up a YWCA at 89 Forest Street. Unfortunately, that house is long gone. But she started up a YWCA, and it boomed. More and more people came to it, and it was thriving, and it was growing by the minute. As a plug, on Wednesday, October 25th, we have a woman named Betty Holloway who's going to be talking specifically about Alice and her family, because they really set the standard for the middle class. They had a newsstand. I mean, it's really quite a fascinating story. I've heard her present on Alice in the past, and she does a great job. October 25th at the Crane House and Historic YWCA at 7 p.m. So if you are interested, do come to that. It's a great program. So as I mentioned, there's this unique structure in Montclair where you don't have that YWCA, but nonetheless, Alice and her women started it up anyway, and this prevented it from becoming a national affiliate. They couldn't figure out what to do with Montclair, and they referred to it constantly as the Montclair situation, which I love. There was segregated leadership at this YWCA. You had the white advisory board of directors that tended to handle more of the financial aspects associated with the YW, but there was a black board of managers, and they handled all the programming. They could hire whom they wanted. They could design what they wanted to do. So really this was, while today it seems antiquated, this was actually quite progressive back then. So in 1920, they've now outgrown this house on Forest Street, and they purchased what was the home of Israel Crane, built in 1796. The irony to that is that we know that Israel Crane actually had at least 2 or 3 enslaved workers. So he the house had been in the Crane family till 1902, and it was rented from there until about 1920, and then it became the YWCA. And you can hear this was an advertisement in the Southern Workman in 1920 that says the house has been made over to include dormitory space, club rooms, a tea room, accommodations for educational classes and social affairs, and the lawn provides a recreation and tennis courts. And then shortly thereafter, they built this little room about 6 years afterwards. It's actually not a little room at all. It looks tiny there by comparison, but it was what they called the rec building, and it was where they held different programs. And that's inside the rec building. So it looks tiny in that picture, but it really was quite a large space. When the Crane House was moved in 1965, the rec building was demolished. So from what I understand, it was in pretty rough condition by then. So you could become part of the YWCA in two ways. There was the day programs, and then there were the boarders who lived there. And interestingly, never the twain met. We have spoken with a lot of women who were part of the YWCA, but we have not spoken with any of the boarders. We've never been able to find any of the boarders because they are so transient. And as women, their names change, which automatically makes it more difficult to look for them. But you can see this is from the census data in 1930. So the building's been open now 10 years and is thriving and is growing and is all well and good. You have these women. This woman, Nicey Seward, actually stayed at the house for the longest amount of time, and she was sort of the house mother there. This is where they hailed from. You have some of them from New Jersey, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, Tennessee, Virginia, and Virginia. Parents also are listed next to it, mainly southern states in there. You also see that there's at least one island, Jamaica's in there. And these are their occupations. You had a chambermaid, somebody that's not working, perhaps she just moved up, a cook, a secretary at the YWCA, a maid, nothing, housekeeper, domestic, and then that just says general work for a private family. The YWCA offered a ton of programs for people who were not living there as well. There were dance classes, summer camps, music classes, larger programs, small meeting groups, clubs. And really, there were sort of, from what I can tell, there were sort of three goals, although they were never stated this way. The one was develop leaders, the other was stress the value of education, and the other one is still pride in their heritage. So developing leaders, and I love that little picture of the little girl conducting in front of a group of people. Lead by examples, hire black women in leadership positions, and then provide leadership training opportunities. So for example, if you want to have a club, you need a president. And if you have a president and a corresponding secretary and all of those things, and you need to learn Robert's Rules of Orders in order to make it happen right, they're not going to get that opportunity in the school system. Because if they can be part of a club, they're certainly not going to be able to be the officers in the club. And so this gave them an opportunity to assume leadership roles that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. They also got very involved statewide. Even though they were not technically a national affiliate, they could still participate in all the activities, and they sent girls to these national conferences all the time. So it really was a way to develop the leader. One of them that they did hire was Hortense Ridley Tate. Hortense Ridley came out from Topeka, Kansas back in 1921 when she was hired as a Girl Reserve Secretary. And now you have to remember the Crane House was right near Lackawanna Station at the time. So she tells the story of getting off that train station and seeing the Crane House where she knows she's going to be working and living over the next few years and just being filled with such pride over this. She became a really guiding light for the girls and women of the Y, even when she no longer worked there. Everybody who I've spoken with who knew her speaks of her incredibly fondly, and she is one of those women that when I cross to the other side through the pearly gates, I want to sit down and chat with, because I think she's just an incredible, incredible woman with what she did and how she went about it. Value of education. There were always debates and programs going on. This is whether or not, this one in particular in 1915, is looking at whether or not co-ed colleges are better than seminaries, which I'm assuming means all girls schools. Help with homework. There were always classes. The other thing that I find really interesting is the women from the YWCA, many of them went on for multiple advanced degrees, not just college, but advanced degrees. And you have to figure this is the 1930s and 40s. Now, my mother was first generation Italian, and she was not permitted to go to college because that money, the college money, was going to her brothers so that they could go to college and not her. So the fact that so many of these women in that period actually not only went to college, but also advanced degrees is something that we take for granted today, but should not be taken for granted in 1930 or 40, because it was really quite a different era during that period. Throughout the years, the program sort of changed as they needed to based on what was happening. So in the 1920s, there were much more recreational and social. There were charm classes, Bible studies, Girl Reserves, huge program, basically like Girl Scout program. 1930s, Depression hits, so then what can we do to help people get jobs that they might need? 1940s, you begin to see with the outbreak of World War II, the hostess clubs, and they start visiting USOs, and you see a lot more in health classes. And then in the 1950s, there's more of the beginnings of the integration of the group, but also they begin to do things like World Day and having programs where they're experiencing and talking about different cultures. And finally, pride and heritage. Now remember, this predates Black History Month. So they would get at the why people coming that is just pretty remarkable. Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, County Cullen, Roland Hayes. There were always people around to chat, to speak, to show people, to show these young women and girls, people who have attained success in their careers. And we have a documentary that we produced, A Place to Become, in order to, when we were first beginning our research on this project. And Sandra Lang will talk about how she met Mary McLeod Bethune. So there were some changes that began to occur over time. In 1920, the National Board published, now this is national, remember the national is the one that can't figure out how to deal with Montclair because there's no white YWCA. They publish a book called Interracial Cooperation, Helpful Suggestions, an article this is, not a book, Helpful Suggestions Concerning Relations of White and Colored Citizens. And in that, basically what they say is, yes, we're all for having African American YWCAs as affiliates of white YWCAs, but you really need those white people to help you because you're just not there yet. So, still not where we want them to be. 1922, however, they recognized that the sign that's in front of the house that says the colored YWCA is not right, and it comes down. And Hortense Tate talks about that, and she actually says, initially, when I first got there and came off that train station and saw that, I was so proud that this was a place for us. And she said, then I began to realize how wrong it was. And so she rejoiced when that sign finally came down. The first black woman served on the National YWCA board in 1924. In the 1920s, here in Montclair, the two boards, the white board of directors and the black board of managers, are meeting socially together, which is really interesting because that was against all social norms during that period. 1931, a member of Montclair's Board of Management asks to sit on the white board. And the white board considers it prayerfully, quote unquote, and decides, yes, you may sit on that board, but you can't have a vote. By the 1930s, you begin to see more camaraderie between the two groups. There's some joint planning, but they're still very separate and distinct boards. And then you hit 1944, and this was sort of what I think of as a watershed year. The Montclair Y experimented with joint meetings, and lo and behold, it worked. It was the first interracial meeting of the Girl Reserves held by the National YWCA, and it was the dawning of the realization that the YWCA in Montclair was a racialized space, and that should change. And the 1944 annual report, the YWCA annual report says, could the YWCA become the one spot in the community where, within its own life, the spirit of democracy could become so prevalent that the organization would be reckoned as more significant in its citizenship because it was a working democracy? Our answer was yes. So they saw a mission. And what I find is so interesting is today when you look at the YWCA's mission, it's empowering women and eliminating racism. Hasn't changed much, has it, since 1946, when the YWCA national charter says wherever there's injustice on the basis of race, whether in the community, the nation, or the world, our protest must be clear and our labor for its removal vigorous and steady. New Jersey, likewise, same time, inserts anti-discrimination language into their constitution, and it passes by a vote of 50 to 18. And this officially kicks off the civil rights movement in New Jersey. Montclair YWCA decides to move forward to get national affiliation. Now, this is kind of interesting because the national board is still trying to figure out how to deal with this Montclair situation. And so now what they're saying is, well, at first they began to hesitate. Well, how can we have a black YWCA become integrated? They grappled with this, as opposed to having a white YWCA that we now allow black people to join. And finally, after much scratching their heads, they said, what's the difference? We can have a black YWCA where now white women can join as well.
And it's the only one in the country.
The only one in the country that didn't have, well, that reversed it. Yes, that's right. The other ones were all, there were about 50 other black YWs, but they all had the white YW in town. This is the only one in the country that didn't have that. The 1947 Montclair Community Audit documented inequalities in all of these things, and the YWCA and the YMCA show up as segregated spaces, and this made national news. This was big, because Montclair even then was sort of considered the bellwether of the epitome of good integration. By 1953, the integration is actually complete. The YWCA becomes national affiliated, the two boards formally merge, and integration is evident on all boards and committees, but far less so in programs. And I think this is interesting because you've got two white girls, two white black girls, and it's a very staged, it's not, we have tons of other pictures of kids in programs, but this one with the integration is a very staged picture that we do have. And what they found was that the adults were willing to integrate, but they were not necessarily willing to send their daughters to integrated programming. Yet, nonetheless, they persisted, and the Montclair Times in the 1960s said, looking back, says it was the one place where you could bring white and black people together was the YW. The town meeting was at the YW. People were comfortable there and knew that they could be treated fairly. Now, I think that the women of the YWCA were working together. Black women and white women were working together now for 40 years. Through the YWCA. And these women recognized the need for this social change. And so they continued to work together and got involved in the Freedom March. They were the same women that were part of the YWCA were the ones who helped to turn the Montclair school system into the magnet school system, which before that had been a neighborhood school, But because they were neighborhoods and the neighborhoods were not integrated, the schools were not as integrated as they should be. Thank you. And Martin Luther King actually came and spoke at Montclair High School in 1966. So Montclair had become really an epicenter. Now, I think, and I'm looking at this from a historical perspective, I think that the YWCA in Montclair forged personal and working relationships between the races early on. Think about it. In other situations, it was employee-employer. This leveled the playing field. This gave both women, black women and white women, an opportunity to work together on equal footing. It helped develop strong, educated women who became the leaders of the community. And I believe it helped Montclair evolve into the richly diverse community that it is today and that it's known for throughout the country. I think that the YWCA in Montclair, YWCA in particular, became incubators for women of both races who could lead change in the community and nationwide. So anybody have any questions or thoughts?
I would like to clarify one point about the schools. Even before integration of the school system, the junior high schools, the neighborhood schools fed into 3 junior high schools, Glenfield, Georginas, and Mount Hebron. And the junior high schools were integrated. The lower schools were neighborhood schools, but the junior high schools, Glenfield and Georginas, were integrated all along, and they fed into the high school. But the neighborhood schools represented the neighborhoods, and that meant that Glenfield was Italian and black, and Georginas was a better mix, because the center of Montclair is the oldest part, Forest Street in that area. That was more of a diverse mix that fed into Georginas. So it seems from the text there that all the schools were segregated, but they were not. It was the neighborhood schools that were the issue with Brown versus education.
Excellent point, and I'll make sure that I reflect that next time I do the talk. Thank you. Carroll was very involved in making it happen. And it was when, I didn't realize you were involved when.
Yes, we wrote the plan for education.
You wrote the plan too? I knew you did.
Yeah, we
I
were
didn't
all,
realize that.
we all represented certain levels of education, and I had the youngest children.
Okay.
So I was into the early childhood,
Okay.
and then there were 5 of us.
Okay.
So it was
And name the other people.
Carroll was over Audrey Green,
Yes, it was Louise Forge, Phyllis Rogers,
there was
Green,
Audrey Green.
Joyce Copeland, Gwen and me. Sometimes it was 7 of us,
Yeah.
but most of the time it was 5 of us. And Jean Kidd was
Oh, yeah,
our best friend.
yeah. And now our daughters are best friends. It's
Yes.
wonderful what
That's
happened.
nice.
Because my daughter would never have known her daughter, because we were from separate ends of the town.
Right.
And they went to early childhood together.
Cool.
Yeah.
How long have you been living in town? All your life? Where'd you grow up? What street?
I grew up on Greenwood Avenue, then I went to Willow Street.
That's in a Forest Street area.
Did you go to the Y?
No, I didn't.
I was at the Y in 1945.
Me too.
Were you?
I lived in Newark at that time. I was born in 38. And I started coming to Montclair because they had a dancing school there. And I came to the dancing school on the bus from Newark up Woodfield Avenue.
To the parade?
Yeah,
To the rec
yeah.
building?
Yeah.
Yeah. That dancing school
It was
must have been quite
wonderful.
something, because more people in the 40s and 50s tell me that they took dance lessons there.
It was wonderful. He thought it was professional. It was
Well, it
special.
was.
It was special. We couldn't go anywhere else, but we all heard about it, and we came all the way up there to go.
Huh. When did you move to
Carla
Montclair?
She was fabulous. Pardon?
When did you move to Montclair?
We moved to Montclair in the 50s. 'Cause I went right into the high school. My sister was younger than I, and she started at Michigan, but I started at the high school. not only that, I had started in Southside High School in Newark as a freshman. Well, when we moved to Montclair, they had no freshmen in the high school.
No ninth graders.
Oh my God, I did not want to live in Montclair and then go to junior high school because I was already in high school. So they called me a spoiled brat. My father drove me to Southside every day until I finished freshman, and then I came to Montclair as a sophomore. My brother was already there at Montclair High School. So and he was a senior when I got there as a sophomore, so that was good because I liked the seniors anyway.
The seniors liked her too.
And when I was a freshman at Southside, I used to hang with all the seniors there too. I guess I looked older because I'm tall or something.
More mature, you'd already into high school.
Yeah, but even at Southside as a freshman, all my friends were seniors, so I was not going to junior high school. That was like
Any other comments,
That's
thoughts?
funny.
yeah.
Very good, very interesting.
Good.
Yes, thank you.
I wish I brought one of my friends here. I'm gonna have her. She's my age now. Somebody that I went to school with at Montclair High School, Caucasian. But we've been working together for our 60th class reunion. And there's so many things she didn't know about how Black people lived in Montclair. I mean, she and I have gotten to be friends through the years, but when I was telling her things, I couldn't go there, she used to
Can't
go.
believe it.
She used to go through the bonds, and I could go in bonds and buy something.
Talk
but
about bonds,
We
yeah.
couldn't eat in bonds.
We couldn't stay. And then, Sandy Lang's father opened a satellite bonds where it was small on Bloomfield Avenue. But we wanted to hang like our classmates did up there on Valley Road. But when there was a football game that we won, and a lot of the Black guys played football, then we were allowed in. We could, it was a big celebration. They didn't put us out.
I thought that only the Black football players could play.
They could go
I
in.
didn't realize that the fans could go in too.
Oh, well, after a game, I guess it was kind of hard to pick and choose and put us out, but,
Okay.
yeah, so again, getting back to my classmate, she didn't know that. She thought, we did everything together. I said, no, we didn't, and so it's really,
It's very interesting because when we do tours of the Crane House and Historic YWCA now, in the last room that on the first floor, it's a club room. And it represents what the Y was like from 1940 to about 1960. And rather than the docent giving the tour, what we do is we simply play a few clips from the documentary that we produced. And it sheds light on things like that. And it's fascinating because the reactions to it are split along racial lines. The Black folks that are there will say, yeah, of course. And the white folks go, hey, here in Montclair? Really? I don't remember it that way.
Yes,
So,
really.
it's very interesting.
yeah, it is, and I was really surprised that,
Yeah.
that she didn't know at all. I mean, the things I was saying, that's why I'm thinking about the YW. I bet any amount of money she didn't even know that existed on Greenwich Avenue.
Probably not.
I don't think so, because we never went to the one on Park Street. And of course, we had the YM on Washington Street where there was a pool, so we could go there. But no, just talking about it, working on our 60th class reunion, and just talking and going out to lunch, and she doesn't know. She's surprised when.
Well, tell her to come by the Crane
All right,
House
she's
one
got
day.
to come,
Yeah.
not just yet.
We're open this Sunday.
I don't think she believes everything I say, because she's like, oh, really? But hearing it from you or somebody else, maybe she'll believe it. But yeah, I'm surprised how surprised she is.
Well, I mentioned during the presentation that on October 25th, did I say? 25th, Betty Holloway is
Okay.
going to be speaking about Alice Foster.
Okay.
And she's done a tremendous amount of research into her.
Yes.
And it's at the Crane House in Historic Y, and it is at 7 o'clock at night. It's a Wednesday night. So you might want to come to that. It's really, it's a good program. She's done a nice job on it. And Alice is a really interesting woman, so she's gotten so tight with her, and apparently she's had some surgery, Betty did.
On
She
her
had some
foot,
surgery, and she's
yeah.
spending all of her time recuperating, working on Alice and studying Alice, and so she's like, I'm talking to her now.
Yeah.
She's in my life.
Yes.
So, yeah, do try and come to that if you can.
Yes.
Well, she lived around the corner on First Street.
Alice did.
And she was always there, you know. And the kids were a little bit afraid of her. Not afraid of Mrs. Tate at all, but more afraid of.
Really?
Well, they, you know, respected her so much that
Yeah.
always on her best behavior.
Was that Mrs. Foster or Mrs. Tate?
Foster?
Foster. And she lived on Forest Street. So when the house was, because I looked in 1920 and it doesn't have her, the directory, it doesn't have her listed on Forest Street. It has her
I'm
on
not sure
Bloomfield
that she
Avenue.
owned it. I don't know. I was only 10 and 12 years old. So I only know that she lived around the corner on Forest Street.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I hope to see